A freezing night wrapped the city in its icy grip. On the corner of Elm and 4th, a shivering man clutched a tattered coat tightly around his body, simply minding his own business. Without warning, 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt, their blinding lights cutting through the darkness and sirens chirping aggressively. To the officers who emerged, he was nothing more than another target, a nobody they could harass to fill the empty hours of a slow shift. They shoved him hard, mocked him viciously, and believed they wielded all the power in the world. They could not have been more wrong. The man they were brutalizing was their new boss. The city of Oak Ridge exhaled its familiar midnight breath, a freezing, damp sigh heavy with the odors of exhaust, stale beer, and quiet desperation. The streets stood largely deserted, broken only by the rumble of an occasional delivery truck navigating the pothole-riddled asphalt, and stray dogs rummaging through dumpsters behind the rusted remains of an old diner. Perched on a frost-covered bus bench, enveloped in a soiled, oversized olive-drab military surplus jacket, sat a man the world had long since decided to overlook. He looked to be in his late 50s, his features concealed by a thick, unkempt graying beard, and a heavy wool beanie tugged low over his eyes. His hands, protected by fingerless gloves, gripped a styrofoam cup that had surrendered its warmth long ago. To passing drivers, he was merely another fragment of urban decay, a heartbreaking statistic born from the city's failing social safety net. Yet beneath the grime, the deliberately scuffed boots, and the meticulously applied scent of cheap whiskey and unwashed clothes, his mind remained razor-sharp. This was Chief Malcolm Langston, only recently sworn in as the new chief of police for the Oak Ridge Police Department. Malcolm had not arrived to coast toward a comfortable retirement. The mayor had specifically recruited him to root out deep-seated corruption. For years, the department, and particularly the 4th Precinct, had been draining taxpayer funds through brutality settlements, false arrest lawsuits, and civil rights violations. Local papers had branded the 4th Precinct the Wild West. The internal reports Malcolm reviewed in his first days were polished works of fiction. Every use of force was justified. Every broken jaw resulted from a suspect resisting. Every suspiciously missing body camera footage was blamed on technical failures. Malcolm understood that paperwork alone could never reveal the truth. He had to see the reality for himself. He had spent decades in Chicago, rising from beat cop to deputy superintendent. He recognized the demeanor, the stride, and the speech of corrupt officers. As a black man in a senior position, he knew subordinates often presented their best behavior in his presence, smiling and saluting while concealing their true natures. So, Malcolm chose to show them a different face. He had invested hours perfecting the disguise. The beard was carefully applied theatrical hair. The dirt beneath his fingernails came from potting soil mixed with grease. He had even rehearsed the hunched, defeated posture of a man crushed by life's hardships. Taped securely to his chest beneath several layers of thermal shirts was a state-of-the-art high-definition digital audio recorder. In his left boot, a small GPS tracker transmitted his location directly to the encrypted phone of Captain Everett Shaw, the only other person in the city aware of this operation. "Stay safe out there," Captain Shaw had cautioned him earlier that evening. "The midshift officers in the 4th Precinct play by their own rules. They're a pack." "That's precisely why I'm going fishing," Chief Langston replied, adjusting his tattered jacket. "I need to see exactly what kind of predators are swimming in these waters." Now, shivering on the bus bench as the freezing wind sliced through his worn jeans, Malcolm waited. He was doing nothing illegal, simply existing in a public space. By law, he had every right to sit there. But according to the unwritten code of the 4th Precinct, he was an eyesore. The low growl of a police cruiser's engine soon shattered the street silence. Malcolm kept his gaze down, but his peripheral vision caught the reflection of the black and white Ford Explorer creeping along Elm Street. The cruiser passed slowly, its tires crunching softly on the frost-dusted pavement, before the brake lights flared bright red. The vehicle halted some distance away and idled for a long, tense minute, like a predator assessing its prey. Then it slammed into reverse, the engine whining, and backed up at a dangerous speed before screeching to a stop directly in front of the bench. The spotlight mounted on the driver's side pillar snapped on, its blinding white beam striking Malcolm full in the face. Malcolm squeezed his eyes shut and lifted a trembling gloved hand to shield himself, playing his role to perfection. "Hey, man," he mumbled, his voice raspy and deliberately weak. "Come on, the light." The driver's side door opened, followed moments later by the passenger side. "Well, well, well," a voice sneered from behind the glare. It was young, arrogant, and laced with venom. "What do we have here? Vance, looks like a piece of trash blew out of the dumpster and landed on our nice clean bench." "Sure looks like it, Pierce," another voice chuckled, as heavy combat boots hit the pavement. Officers Garrett Vance and Logan Pierce. Malcolm knew their files intimately. Vance had multiple excessive force complaints in recent months, all mysteriously dismissed. Pierce was a known enabler without a moral compass, content to ride along with Vance's abuses. The real test had begun. Malcolm drew a slow, measured breath, letting the icy air fill his lungs. He lowered his hand slightly, squinting into the glare as he waited for the badge-carrying thugs to make their next move. "I asked you a question, old man," Officer Vance barked, his silhouette cutting through the spotlight's halo. He approached with the swagger of a schoolyard bully, his hand resting casually on his taser. I didn't hear a question, officer," Malcolm stammered, modulating his deep baritone into a meek, wavering rasp. He kept his eyes averted, fixed on the scuffed tips of his boots. "I'm just resting, just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Officer Pierce chimed in, rounding the front of the cruiser. He was taller and broader than Vance, chewing gum with a steady rhythm. "The early morning buses don't run for hours yet, buddy. You're loitering." "It's a public bench, sir," Malcolm said quietly. "I just needed to get off my feet. It's cold." "Oh, he knows his rights, Pierce," Vance sneered, stepping within 2 feet of Malcolm. The smell of cheap cologne and stale coffee wafted from him. "We got a constitutional scholar out here freezing his ass off." Vance suddenly kicked the toe of Malcolm's boot hard enough to sting. "Stand up." Malcolm calculated the legalities in an instant. A Terry stop required reasonable, articulable suspicion of a crime. Sitting on a bench was not a crime. This was an unlawful order. But as an undercover operative testing his officers, he needed to witness the full extent of their misconduct. He slowly pushed himself off the bench, releasing a convincing groan as he rose, keeping his posture slouched. Physically larger than both men beneath the baggy layers, he compressed himself to appear smaller, weaker and utterly vulnerable. "Hands out of your pockets," Pierce commanded, unsnapping the retention strap on his holster in an aggressive, unnecessary escalation. Malcolm complied, pulling his hands out and holding them loosely at his sides. "I ain't doing nothing wrong, officers. My name's Jimmy. I'm just trying to stay out of the wind." "I don't give a damn if your name is the King of England," Vance snapped. He stepped into Malcolm's personal space, aggressively crowding him. "You're in my sector, Jimmy, and in my sector, we don't like vagrants stinking up the bus stops. You make the good tax-paying folks uncomfortable." "Nobody else is out here," Malcolm pointed out mildly. "Don't get smart with me, boy," Vance hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing octave. The racial undertone of the word boy struck Malcolm like a physical blow. It was a word meant to strip away dignity, wielded by a young punk in uniform against a man he saw as a helpless, elderly black man. Malcolm's jaw tightened beneath the false beard, but he maintained his expression of perfect fear. "Turn around. Face the bench. Put your hands on the back of it," Vance ordered. Another violation. No probable cause for a search. Malcolm turned and placed his gloved hands on the freezing metal of the bench backrest. Before he could brace himself, Vance kicked his legs apart violently, nearly dropping him to his knees. Pierce laughed from behind. "Hey, take it easy, please," Malcolm cried out, playing the victim. Vance began a rough, invasive pat-down, his hands slapping aggressively against Malcolm's pockets, feeling down his legs, and yanking up the hem of his heavy jacket. Malcolm held his breath, praying the thick layers would conceal the flat digital recorder taped to his sternum. "What's in the pockets?" Vance demanded, ignoring Malcolm's plea. He didn't wait for an answer. He plunged his hands into the deep pockets of the military jacket and pulled out a crumpled pack of tissues, a few loose quarters, and a faded photograph of a young woman, a prop Malcolm had brought to add humanity to his character. Vance examined the items under the street lamp, then deliberately let them fall. The quarters clattered across the pavement, rolling into the gutter. The photograph fluttered down, landing face up in a puddle of muddy slush. "Hey, that's my daughter!" Malcolm yelled, allowing a genuine flash of anger to color his voice. He moved to turn and retrieve the picture. "Stay facing the bench!" Pierce roared, shoving Malcolm hard between the shoulder blades. Malcolm slammed into the cold metal, his chest heaving. "You got ID, Jimmy?" Vance asked, seemingly unfazed by Malcolm's distress. "No, lost my wallet last week. I told you, I'm just resting." "No ID, no address, loitering, and resisting an officer," Vance listed, ticking imaginary charges on his fingers. "Sounds to me like you're having a very bad night, Jimmy." "I didn't resist," Malcolm said, forcing his voice to tremble. "Please just let me get my picture and I'll walk away. I'll leave the sector." Vance glanced at Pierce and grinned. "He wants to leave the sector, Logan. I think we should help him out with that, don't you?" Pierce chuckled, a dark, unpleasant sound. "Absolutely, Garrett. We're public servants. It's our job to provide transportation to those in need." A cold knot formed in Malcolm's stomach. He knew exactly what they meant. In Chicago, they called it a rough ride. In other cities, a starlight tour. It was an old, ugly police tactic used to punish undesirables without the paperwork of an arrest. They would throw the victim into the back of a cruiser, drive them miles outside the city into the freezing countryside, and dump them on the side of a dark road to walk back. In sub-zero temperatures, it was torture. In some cases, it was a death sentence. "Put your hands behind your back," Vance ordered, pulling steel handcuffs from his belt. "For what? What am I being arrested for?" Malcolm asked, turning his head. "You're not being arrested," Vance whispered, stepping close enough for Malcolm to smell the mint gum masking tobacco on his breath. "You're being relocated. Now give me your hands before I break your wrist." Malcolm allowed his hands to be pulled behind his back. The cold steel bit brutally into his wrists as Vance ratcheted them far too tight, the metal digging into bone. Malcolm bit the inside of his cheek to suppress a grunt of pain. They grabbed him by the biceps, essentially lifting him off his feet, and frog-marched him toward the idling cruiser. As they approached the rear door, Malcolm noticed a small, blinking red light on Vance's chest disappear. He had silently clicked off his body camera. Pierce did the same a moment later. "They're going dark," Malcolm thought, his blood boiling. "They're turning off the cameras so there's no record of the abduction." "Watch your head, trash," Vance mocked, before violently shoving Malcolm down into the back seat. Malcolm's head cracked against the plastic partition. He slumped onto the hard plastic bench as the door slammed shut, sealing him in the suffocating darkness of the cage. The back of a police cruiser was designed to be uncomfortable, a cage of hard plastic, metal mesh, and zero leverage. With his hands cuffed tightly behind him, the awkward angle forced Malcolm to sit hunched forward, his shoulders screaming in protest. The heavy plexiglass partition couldn't block out the sound of their voices. The cruiser shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving Malcolm's meager belongings and the photograph behind in the desolate night. "Central, this is 4, Adam 12. Pierce's voice crackled over the radio, sounding bored and routine. "Show us clear from Elm and 4th. No report. Resuming patrol." "Copy 4 Adam 12, the dispatcher's voice replied, unaware that her officers were committing a felony kidnapping. "God, I hate this shift," Vance complained, turning the heat up in the front cabin. The warm air blasted into the front, but the vents to the rear cage remained closed. Malcolm shivered in the freezing back seat, the cold seeping through his inadequate layers. "Just a few more hours, man," Pierce replied, tapping on his phone. "Then we hit up that diner on 9th for the breakfast special. Sarah's working." "Yeah, well, we gotta take out the trash first," Vance said, glancing in the rearview mirror. His eyes met Malcolm's through the thick plexiglass. "How you doing back there, Jimmy? Enjoying the ride?" Malcolm didn't answer. He slumped against the plastic door panel, letting his chin rest on his chest. He was hyper-focused on the red recording light of the device taped to his chest. He needed them to keep talking. He needed them to dig their own graves so deep that no police union attorney could dig them out. "He's giving us the silent treatment," Pierce laughed. "You think he's going to complain to the mayor?" Vance scoffed. "Who's he going to complain to? Look at him. He's a ghost, a nobody. These people come into our city. They suck up resources. They make the streets look like a damn third world country. And what does the brass want us to do? Hand out blankets and warm cocoa." "Hear about the new chief?" Pierce asked, the conversation shifting exactly where Malcolm wanted. "Langston." Vance spat the name like a curse. "Yeah, I heard about him. Some diversity hire they brought in from Chicago to reform us. Guys like that, they don't know the streets. They sit in their plush offices making six figures telling us how to do our jobs, while we're out here in the mud dealing with animals like Jimmy here." Malcolm's heart hammered a furious rhythm against his ribs. The sheer arrogance of these men was astounding. They felt entirely untouchable. "I heard Langston is looking to make an example out of the 4th Precinct," Pierce said, a hint of concern creeping into his voice. "Internal Affairs has been sniffing around Beck's squad." "Let them sniff," Vance said dismissively, taking a hard right turn that threw Malcolm violently against the opposite door panel. The cuffs bit deeper into his wrists, drawing a thin line of blood. "Sergeant Beck has our backs. The Union has our backs. Langston is going to realize real quick that he can't run this city without us. If he pushes too hard, the blue flu hits. We all call out sick, let the city burn for a weekend. He'll come crawling back begging us to put the uniforms on." Malcolm memorized the name. Sergeant Harlan Beck. He was their immediate supervisor. If Beck was providing top cover for this behavior, the rot went deeper than patrol officers. It meant middle management was actively conspiring to protect abusers. The city streetlights began to space out as the cruiser left the urban density of Oak Ridge and headed toward the desolate county lines. Buildings gave way to empty lots, industrial warehouses, and eventually the dark skeletal silhouettes of winter-stripped woods. Where are you taking me?" Malcolm finally spoke up, letting his voice crack with feigned terror. "Please, just let me out here. I can walk back." "Walk back from here?" Vance laughed, looking out at the pitch-black scenery. "Nah, Jimmy. You need some exercise. Clear your head. We know a great spot. Very scenic. Lots of nature." "It's freezing," Malcolm pleaded. "I don't have a hat. My coat is thin. I'll freeze to death out here." "Not our problem," Pierce stated coldly. "You should have thought about that before you decided to make our city look ugly. Consider this a motivational seminar to relocate to a different county." They were crossing the boundary line. The city limits ended at the crossing of the Blackwood River Bridge. The cruiser rumbled over the metal grating, the tires singing a hollow, eerie tune. The temperature outside had dropped well below freezing. The wind chill was brutal. Dumping a man out here without proper winter gear, miles from the nearest open business, was not just cruel, it was attempted murder. Vance pulled the cruiser onto a gravel turnout near the edge of a dense, unlit pine forest. The tires crunched to a halt. He shifted into park and turned off the headlights, plunging the vehicle into total darkness. Only the ambient glow of the police dashboard illuminated the cab. "End of the line, Jimmy," Vance said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Pierce stepped out first, drawing his heavy maglite flashlight. He walked around to the rear passenger door and yanked it open. The biting wind rushed into the cage, hitting Malcolm like a wall of ice. "Out!" Pierce commanded, grabbing Malcolm by the collar of his jacket and hauling him out of the vehicle. Malcolm stumbled, his legs stiff from the cold and awkward position. He landed hard on his knees in the frozen gravel. Pierce didn't offer a hand. He just stepped back, shining the blinding beam directly into Malcolm's eyes. Vance walked around the back of the cruiser, his boots crunching loudly. He reached down, grabbed Malcolm by the arm, and hauled him to his feet. "Turn around," Vance barked. Malcolm turned, presenting his cuffed hands. He felt the cold metal of the key slide into the lock. The cuffs clicked open, and Malcolm immediately brought his arms forward, rubbing his raw, bleeding wrists. "Now listen to me very carefully, Jimmy," Vance said, stepping close and jabbing a rigid finger into Malcolm's chest, right over the hidden recorder. "If I ever see your ugly face in my city again, I won't be this nice. Next time I'll find some drugs in your pocket, and you'll spend the next 5 years in a concrete box. You understand me?" Malcolm looked down at the arrogant young officer. For a brief second, the facade of the terrified, broken homeless man slipped. Chief Langston's posture straightened, his shoulders squaring. The aura of command and authority radiating from him was palpable, causing Vance to involuntarily take a half-step back, confused by the sudden shift. "I understand exactly what you are," Malcolm said, his voice dropping the wavering rasp. It was deep, resonant, and entirely steady. Vance frowned, his hand instinctively dropping to his taser. "What did you say to me, trash?" Malcolm immediately slouched back down, shrinking into character. "I said I understand, officer. I won't come back." Vance stared at him for a second longer, unnerved, but unable to articulate why. He shook his head, regaining his bravado. "Start walking, Jimmy. Keep your eyes forward." Vance and Pierce climbed back into the warm cruiser. The engine revved, the tires spun slightly in the gravel, and the vehicle tore off down the dark county road, its taillights quickly fading into the oppressive blackness. Chief Malcolm Langston was left standing alone in the freezing darkness, miles from civilization. He waited until the sound of the cruiser's engine was completely swallowed by the wind. Then he stood up straight. He reached down into his left boot, feeling the small rectangular shape of the encrypted GPS tracker. He tapped the single button on its face 3 times in rapid succession, the SOS signal. Within seconds, his concealed earpiece chirped to life. "Chief Langston, this is Captain Shaw." The voice came through crisp and urgent. "We have your distress ping. Are you secure?" "I am secure, Everett," Malcolm replied, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He reached under his thermal layers and pressed the stop button on the digital recorder. "The package has been delivered, and we have everything we need." "Copy that. I have 3 unmarked units vectoring to your location now. ETA is just a few minutes. Stay out of the wind, sir." "Make it quick, Everett," Malcolm said, staring down the dark, empty road where his officers had vanished. "We have a lot of garbage to take out in the morning." The piercing glare of halogen headlights cut through the desolate county woods, fracturing the absolute darkness. 3 unmarked black Chevy Tahoes roared up the gravel turnout, their tires kicking up a storm of frost and dirt. Before the lead vehicle even rocked to a complete halt, the passenger door flew open. Captain Everett Shaw, a seasoned veteran with a face weathered by decades of city homicides, stepped out into the freezing wind. He held a heavy wool blanket in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. "Chief," Shaw called out, his voice fighting the howling wind. Malcolm Langston stepped out from the tree line, his false beard dusted with frost, his shoulders shivering uncontrollably despite his iron will. He looked every bit the broken vagrant the patrolman believed him to be, but the fierce, unyielding fire in his eyes told a completely different story. "Get in! Get in!" Shaw urged, wrapping the thick blanket around Malcolm's shoulders and ushering him into the cavernous, heated back seat of the Tahoe. Waiting inside with an open laptop was Detective Sophia Langford, the lead investigator for internal affairs. She was notoriously ruthless, a bulldog of a detective who had built a career dismantling corrupt units. Tonight, she was Langston's chosen executioner. "Sir," Langford said, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the chief of police looking like discarded street trash. "Let's get to work, Sophia," Malcolm said, his voice raspy from the cold. His hands shook as he accepted the scalding thermos from Shaw. He took a long, painful sip, feeling the heat radiate down his throat and into his frozen chest. He reached under his layers, ripped the surgical tape off his sternum with a wince, and handed the digital audio recorder to Langford. Langford plugged the device into her laptop. Within seconds, the crisp, undeniable audio of the last 45 minutes filled the quiet cabin. They listened in silence. They heard the unlawful order, the aggressive physical contact, the blatant violation of civil rights, and the terrifying mocking cruelty of the Starlight Tour. when Vance's voice crackled through the speakers saying, "Consider this a motivational seminar to relocate to a different county." Langford's jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. "Unbelievable," Shaw muttered, staring out the window at the bleak landscape. "Miles out in sub-zero weather. If you were actually an elderly homeless man, Malcolm, you'd be dead by morning." "That's the point, Everett," Malcolm said, his voice steadying as the Tahoe sped back toward the city limits. "And they didn't care. But here is the piece that matters most. Play back the audio at the point where they mention their sergeant, Sophia." Langford clicked the mouse. "Sergeant Beck has our backs. The Union has our backs. Langston is going to realize real quick that he can't run this city without us." Langford's fingers flew across the keyboard as she typed the name into her database. "Harlan Beck, 20-year veteran. He's been running the midshift at the 4th for years. We've had a dozen anonymous tips about a protection racket over there, but no one ever steps up to testify. The victims are always transients, prostitutes, or undocumented immigrants. People who can't or won't go to the authorities." Malcolm leaned forward, the heat of the vehicle finally thawing the ice in his bones. "It's not just a few bad apples, Sophia. It's an orchard rotting from the roots up. Beck is contracting his officers out as a private off-the-books enforcement squad for local business owners. He clears the undesirables out of the commercial districts, completely bypassing the judicial system. And I guarantee you, he is taking a cash cut from those businesses for the service. We have them on kidnapping, false imprisonment, battery, and conspiracy to violate civil rights," Langford listed, her fingers flying as she drafted emergency warrants. "Federal charges, Chief, not state. I'm waking up the U.S. Attorney for the district right now." "Do it," Malcolm commanded. "And Everett, I want a full tactical lockdown of the 4th Precinct at first light. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out. You confiscate the duty weapons of Vance, Pierce, and Beck the second they cross the threshold." "What about the Union?" Shaw asked, playing devil's advocate. "The moment we move on Beck, they'll threaten a walkout." "Let them," Malcolm said, his eyes hard and cold as the city skyline came back into view. "I'd rather patrol this city by myself than employ men who leave the vulnerable to freeze to death in the dark. Drop me at headquarters, Everett. I need a shower, a razor, and my uniform." A short while later, the transformation was absolute. Gone was Jimmy, the shivering, hunched vagrant, in the soiled military jacket. Standing in front of the full-length mirror in the chief's private suite was Chief Malcolm Langston. The theatrical beard was washed away, revealing a strong, square jaw and sharp, calculating eyes. He wore a crisp, midnight blue dress uniform, perfectly tailored. The 4 gold stars on his collar gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His brass nameplate, Langston, sat perfectly level above his left breast pocket. He didn't just look like a police chief. He looked like a force of nature. "Time to go hunting," Malcolm whispered to his reflection. He grabbed his service weapon, snapped it into his holster, and walked out of the office. The storm was ready to break. The roll call room of the 4th Precinct smelled exactly as it always did at the start of shift change, a potent mixture of damp wool, gun oil, cheap glazed donuts, and stale coffee. The room was packed with officers transitioning between shifts. The night guys looked exhausted, their uniforms rumpled, while the day guys were loud, caffeinated, and complaining about the bitter cold. Sitting at a heavy wooden table near the back were officers Garrett Vance and Logan Pierce. They were completely relaxed, radiating an air of smug invincibility. Vance scrolled through his phone, laughing at a text, while Pierce aggressively chewed fresh gum and detailed their breakfast plans. Standing at the front of the room, leaning casually against the wooden podium, was Sergeant Harlan Beck. He was a bulldog of a man, thick-necked, red-faced, and carrying extra weight around his midsection. He held a clipboard, waiting for the briefing to begin. At the designated time, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung shut with a loud metallic clack. Captain Everett Shaw, flanked by Detective Sophia Langford and 4 heavily armed internal affairs investigators, stepped in front of the exit, physically blocking it. The room's ambient chatter dialed down as a few officers noticed the IA jackets. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. I never showed up at roll call unless blood was about to be spilled. Lock the doors, Shaw ordered quietly. An investigator threw the heavy deadbolt. A second later, the side door near the podium, the entrance reserved for command staff, opened. Chief Malcolm Langston strode into the room. The silence that fell over the 4th precinct was instantaneous and deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the air. Cops who were slouching immediately sat bolt upright. Sergeant Beck practically jumped to attention, tossing his clipboard onto the podium. "Room, attention!" Beck barked, though his voice wavered slightly. 30 pairs of boots snapped together. Malcolm walked slowly to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his officers. He let the silence hang, letting the tension build until it felt heavy enough to shatter the fluorescent bulbs overhead. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. "At ease," Malcolm finally commanded. The officers relaxed their stances, but nobody dared to sit down. Malcolm moved to the podium, stepping right next to Sergeant Beck. He rested his hands on the wood, his gold stars catching the harsh light. "Good morning," Malcolm began, his deep, resonant voice filling every corner of the silent room. "I know it's unusual for the chief of police to crash a precinct roll call, but I felt it was necessary to address some fundamental principles of our profession. Principles that it seems have been forgotten in this building." In the back row, Vance leaned over to Pierce. "Here comes the Chicago diversity speech," he whispered, rolling his eyes. Pierce gave a tight, nervous smirk, but his eyes kept darting to the IA detectives blocking the exit. "We are entrusted with an immense amount of power," Malcolm continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "The power to strip a citizen of their freedom, the power to use force. With that power comes a sacred trust. When we break that trust, we are no longer law enforcement officers. We are an armed gang operating under the color of law." Malcolm stopped pacing. He turned and locked eyes directly with Officer Garrett Vance. Vance swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. "It's cold out there, isn't it, Officer Vance?" Malcolm asked, his tone conversational, but his eyes burning like blue-hot steel. Vance blinked, completely caught off guard by the direct address. Yes, sir. Yes, Chief. It's freezing." "Indeed it is," Malcolm nodded slowly. "Well below freezing. Not the kind of weather you'd want to be out in without a good coat. Tell me, Vance, what time do the buses start running in your sector?" A cold bead of sweat broke out on the back of Vance's neck. The specific question triggered a profound sense of déjà vu. Early morning, sir." Malcolm repeated the answer, his voice dropping an octave. "So if a man was sitting on a public bench in the middle of the night waiting, say for a bus that wouldn't come for hours, he'd be loitering, wouldn't he?" Pierce abruptly stopped chewing his gum, his face draining of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. He stared at the chief, his mind frantically trying to process the impossibility of the words he was hearing. Vance felt a tremor start in his hands. "Sir, I don't—" Malcolm reached into his tailored uniform pocket. He pulled out a crumpled, mud-stained piece of paper. He walked down the center aisle, the crowd of officers parting for him like the Red Sea. He stopped directly in front of the table where Vance and Pierce were seated. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow motion, Malcolm placed the muddy photograph of the young woman onto the table. "You dropped this, Garrett," Malcolm said softly. The rasp of Jimmy bled perfectly into the chief's baritone. Vance stared at the photo, his breath hitching in his throat. His eyes darted from the picture to the gold stars, to the face of the man he had violently shoved into the back of a cruiser just hours earlier. The beard was gone. The dirt was gone. But the eyes, the hard, unyielding eyes, were exactly the same. "Oh my God," Pierce whispered, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror escaping his lips. "Stand up, both of you," Malcolm roared, the sheer volume and authority of his voice making half the room flinch. Vance and Pierce scrambled to their feet, their knees shaking so violently they could barely hold their own weight. Malcolm turned his back on them and looked at Detective Langford. "Sophia, play the tape." Langford pulled a wireless speaker from her tactical vest and tapped her phone. The audio filled the quiet room. "Put your hands behind your back." "For what? What am I being arrested for?" "You're not being arrested. You're being relocated. Now give me your hands before I break your wrist." The sound of ratcheting handcuffs, the sickening thud of a body hitting a plastic partition. The 30 other officers in the room stood frozen in absolute horror. They were listening to their colleagues committing a felony, broadcast loud and clear in front of the Chief of Police and Internal Affairs. Sergeant Beck's face had turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He stepped away from the podium, his hands raised defensively. "Chief Langston, listen, I don't know what they were doing. This is the first I'm hearing of." Malcolm raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Keep playing, Sophia." The audio skipped forward. "Sergeant Beck has our backs. The Union has our backs. Langston is going to realize real quick that he can't run this city without us." Malcolm slowly turned his head to look at Sergeant Beck. The veteran sergeant was physically shaking. His career, his pension, and his freedom were evaporating right before his eyes. "It seems you have their backs, Harlan," Malcolm said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "And I have the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the United States Attorney's Office, and the full weight of the Constitution." Malcolm looked back at Vance and Pierce. The arrogant, untouchable bullies from the night before were entirely gone. In their place were two terrified men realizing that their lives were over. "You thought I was trash," Malcolm said, stepping so close to Vance that the young officer had to look up into the chief's furious eyes. "You thought because a man had nothing, he was nothing. You swore an oath to protect the people of this city, and instead you hunted them for sport." Malcolm turned to Captain Shaw. "Strip their badges," he commanded, the finality ringing in the air like a gavel strike. "Strip their weapons. Arrest officers Vance and Pierce for aggravated battery, kidnapping, and federal civil rights violations." Shaw stepped forward, unholstering his handcuffs. "And Sergeant Beck," Malcolm added, his gaze shifting to the panicked supervisor. "Arrest him for conspiracy and racketeering. The 4th Precinct is officially under new management." The metallic snick-snick of the handcuffs ratcheting around Officer Garrett Vance's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the dead-silent roll call room. Captain Everett Shaw was not gentle. He wrenched Vance's arms backward, mirroring the exact brutal angle Vance had used on the chief hours earlier. Vance gasped, his face buried in the polished wood of the table. His service weapon and brass badge already lay stripped and useless near the muddy photograph. Pierce didn't even resist. When Detective Langford approached him, the towering, broad-shouldered cop simply held out his hands, weeping openly. The sudden violent reality of a federal prison sentence had entirely broken his spirit. Sergeant Harlan Beck, however, still clung to the delusion of his untouchability. As 2 Internal Affairs investigators grabbed his biceps, he thrashed violently. "Get your hands off me," Beck spat, his face a mask of panicked rage. "I'm a 20-year veteran. You can't do this, Langston. The fraternal order won't stand for this ambush. I want my union rep right now." As if summoned by the sheer desperation in Beck's voice, the heavy deadbolt on the back door clicked, and a frantic pounding echoed through the room. Captain Shaw nodded to an investigator who cracked the door open. A man in a sharp, expensive charcoal suit shoved his way into the room. He was clutching a leather briefcase and breathing heavily. It was Richard Kincaid, the high-priced defense attorney for the police union, known throughout the state for making excessive force charges magically disappear. "What the hell is going on here?" Kincaid demanded, his voice booming with practiced courtroom authority. He took in the sight of the handcuffed officers and the grim faces of IA. "Chief Langston, I'm ordering you to halt these proceedings immediately. My clients are invoking their right to counsel, and unless you have a legally binding warrant, this is an illegal detainment." Chief Malcolm Langston did not flinch. He slowly stepped away from the podium and walked toward the high-powered attorney. He towered over Kincaid, the gold stars on his collar gleaming ominously. "Mr. Kincaid," Malcolm said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, "you are trespassing in a secure law enforcement facility during an active federal raid." "Federal raid?" Kincaid scoffed, though his eyes darted nervously to the IA agents. "You don't have the jurisdiction to authorize." "I don't. The Department of Justice does." Malcolm reached into the inner pocket of his dress uniform jacket and pulled out a thick folded stack of papers, bearing the official seal of the United States District Court. He shoved them aggressively into Kincaid's chest. Signed by Federal Magistrate Judge William Davies, arrest warrants for Garrett Vance and Logan Pierce for felony kidnapping, aggravated assault, and deprivation of rights under color of law, and for Sergeant Harlan Beck, a federal warrant for racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion. Kincaid scrambled to catch the papers, his eyes skimming the heavy legal text. The color rapidly drained from his face as he realized the magnitude of the situation. There were no union loopholes for federal civil rights violations. The FBI was taking over. "Extortion," Kincaid whispered, the fight completely leaving him. "Detective Langford," Malcolm called out, not taking his eyes off the defeated attorney. "Update the room on the simultaneous operation." Sophia Langford stepped forward, holding her tablet. At first light, an FBI tactical team raided Sergeant Beck's private residence and his precinct locker. We secured 3 physical ledgers documenting off-the-books cash payments from numerous local business owners. Payments made specifically to Beck's squad in exchange for the illegal intimidation, assault, and relocation of homeless individuals and minorities from the commercial district. A collective gasp swept through the remaining officers in the room. The casual brutality was one thing. Some of them had suspected it and turned a blind eye. But a calculated, organized crime syndicate running out of their own precinct? The shame in the room was palpable. "You see, Richard," Malcolm said softly, stepping back from the attorney. "This isn't an internal review. This isn't a paid administrative leave. This is an eradication. Now step aside or I will have you arrested for obstructing a federal investigation." Kincaid swallowed hard, clutching his briefcase. He looked at Beck, who was staring back at him with wide, pleading eyes. Kincaid slowly shook his head and took 2 steps back, pressing himself against the concrete wall. The blue wall of silence had just been pulverized. "Captain Shaw," Malcolm commanded, "take the garbage out." The perp walk was a spectacle. Instead of sneaking the disgraced officers out the back, Malcolm ordered them march straight through the main bullpen of the 4th Precinct. Dozens of detectives, desk sergeants, and civilian clerks watched in stunned silence as Vance, Pierce, and Beck were led out in steel cuffs, their uniforms stripped of their badges, their heads hung low in ultimate disgrace. When they were finally loaded into the back of the armored federal transport vans waiting outside, Malcolm stood on the precinct steps, the freezing wind whipping at his uniform. He watched the vans pull away, knowing this was only the first battle in a very long war. In the days that followed, the city of Oak Ridge was still reeling from the shockwaves. The story had exploded onto the national news. The headlines were relentless. Police chief goes undercover, dismantles corrupt squad. The Starlight tours end in federal indictments. The fallout was massive. The Department of Justice announced a sweeping top-to-bottom audit of the entire Oak Ridge Police Department. Several more officers from the 4th Precinct, terrified by the federal charges against Beck, voluntarily turned in their badges and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. The cancer was being excised cell by corrupt cell. At midday, a massive press conference assembled on the grand marble steps of City Hall. Hundreds of reporters, community activists, and ordinary citizens crowded the plaza. The air was electric with a mixture of anger, relief, and cautious optimism. Standing behind a cluster of microphones was Mayor Philip Grant, looking incredibly grave. But the man the city was waiting for stood right beside him. Chief Malcolm Langston stepped up to the podium. The flashes of cameras strobed violently, a blinding barrage of light that rivaled the spotlight Vance had used to blind him in the freezing dark. Malcolm looked out over the sea of faces. He saw the marginalized, the forgotten, and the broken, the very people he had disguised himself to protect. He placed his hands on the edges of the podium, grounding himself. "Days ago," Malcolm's deep, booming voice echoed across the plaza, instantly silencing the murmuring crowd. "I took a walk through the streets of this city. I did not wear these stars. I did not wear this uniform. I wore the clothes of a man who had fallen on hard times, and in return for simply existing in a public space, I was assaulted, humiliated, and left to freeze to death by the very men sworn to protect me." He paused, letting the heavy reality of his words sink into the crowd. For too long, the badge has been used by some as a shield for bigotry, cruelty, and corruption. They believed that because their victims were invisible to society, their crimes would be invisible to justice. They were wrong. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out the muddy, crumpled photograph of the young woman. He held it up for the cameras to see. This picture was meant to be a prop, but it represents something very real. It represents the humanity that bad cops strip away from the people they abuse. When an officer looks at a citizen and sees only trash to be swept away, they forfeit their right to wear the badge. They forfeit their right to be called peace officers. The plaza was completely silent, save for the rapid clicking of camera shutters. To the community of Oak Ridge, Malcolm continued, his eyes scanning the crowd and meeting the gazes of the citizens. I cannot fix the past. I cannot undo the trauma inflicted by those who abused their power. But I stand before you today to make an ironclad promise. The era of the Wild West is over. The blue wall of silence has been torn down. From this day forward, accountability is not a buzzword in this department. It is a mandate. He lowered the photograph, his jaw set with fierce determination. We will root out the bullies. We will expel the predators. We will build a police force that serves the city with honor, with empathy, and with absolute, unwavering justice. Thank you. The applause started slowly, rippling through the front rows of community organizers before erupting into a deafening roar that echoed off the towering glass buildings of the city skyline. It wasn't just applause. It was the sound of a fractured city finally taking a breath of clean air. Hours later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Chief Malcolm Langston sat alone in his quiet office at police headquarters. The adrenaline of the past days had finally faded, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its wake. He knew the fight was far from over. The Union would push back. The systemic rot would take years to fully cleanse. There would be more long nights, more battles, and more resistance. He leaned back in his leather chair and looked down at his expansive mahogany desk. Right next to his gold-plated nameplate, framed in simple, elegant glass, was the muddy, crumpled photograph of the fictional daughter. He kept it there not as a prop, but as a permanent reminder. A reminder of the freezing cold, the biting steel of the handcuffs, and the absolute necessity of staying vigilant. As long as there were predators hiding behind a badge, Chief Malcolm Langston would be waiting for them in the dark. If this story stirred something in you, if your heart pounded during this fight for justice, don't let it end here. Like this video to show your support for real accountability and true leadership. Share this powerful story with your friends and family to spread the message that nobody is above the law. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling tale of justice served. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you were Chief Langston.